Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 9. Today we're going to be covering Descartes, and we're also going to be covering him in our next lecture. Specifically, we're going to be covering his work called the Meditations. Before we get to Descartes and his Meditations, though, I should say that we're taking quite a leap here from Aristotle to Descartes, and there's actually a lot of philosophers, both Christian and non-Christian, which lived between that time. So because this is an intro philosophy course, we have to skip ahead to some of the more major figures, but there is quite a lot to be known if you are interested in knowing what happened between Aristotle and Descartes. So with that said, let's move on to Descartes, who lived between 1596 and 1650 AD, or CE, as you might have it. So Descartes was an educated man and was well off to the degree that he could afford his education and his travels. Descartes received what's known as a Jesuit education, so it was an education run by the Jesuit church, and proceeded to attend a major school in Paris afterwards. After graduating, he spent his time being a soldier in various armies, and after he was done being a soldier, he traveled Europe, talking to various different people. And while he was traveling Europe, this is when he was writing his philosophy, specifically the one we're going to be reading today, the Meditations 1, 2, and 3. And next lecture, we're going to be covering 4, 5, and 6. So, now, lastly, as far as Descartes' biography goes, after writing his philosophy and becoming relatively popular, he was invited to Sweden, and he hated it there because it was pretty cold, and a few months after getting there, he died of pneumonia. So that's how Descartes' story ends. But enough of that. Why did Descartes leave the world of academia in the first place? I mean, he was in school and he did very well and was very respected. Well, after graduating from his studies in Paris, he still found himself dissatisfied with what he had learned. He doubted much of what people had told him was true, the supposed experts in the world. And this kind of rings similar to Socrates' sort of situation. And I'm not enough of a scholar to know whether Descartes was trying to, in some ways, echo the feeling of Socrates, but in any case, this is the story he gives us. So after graduating from the school in Paris, he was dissatisfied with what he had learned because he wasn't, he doubted it. It wasn't very certain to him. And so, according to him, by going to school, he discovered his own ignorance. Neither what he was taught in classes nor what he read on his own time seemed to offer any certain knowledge. Despite all this, he did well in school and gained the respect of a lot of people, which is why he sort of was a little bit confused, because a lot of people seemed to think he had a lot of knowledge, and yet he wasn't so sure about the knowledge that he supposedly had received. So after university, Descartes decided to seek knowledge among people in the world, and as well as within himself, because those are the two other options. He's either going to learn something from things in the world, or he's going to learn either more about himself or from himself. So what he did was he visited courts, so that's basically like the inner circle of a monarchy, and he, as I mentioned, participated in various armies. He also visited men of, as he calls them, diverse temperament and conditions. And this can basically just mean that he's going around sampling different types of people. So we have, a construction worker here, we have a doctor there, different people from different walks of life. He collected various experiences doing this way, and he tested himself in various situations. So it wasn't all just a walk in the park. He wanted to actually get some real experience on his own shoulders. Ultimately, Descartes ended up doing this for about 9 years, in hopes to gain some ability to tell truth from fiction. Instead of gaining more knowledge, however, Descartes began to discard more and more beliefs. Beliefs brought by tradition especially seemed faulty, as his travels taught him that lots of different people have lots of different beliefs and traditions. And so beliefs that were given to us by tradition seemingly conflict with those given by the tradition of others. So there's no real certainty in relying on tradition, at least according to Descartes. So ultimately, Descartes failed in finding any knowledge in the world around him, so instead he turned to finding knowledge within himself, that other option I mentioned. The introspection that he performed is recorded in his work, The Meditations. And the full name of it is Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, there are 6 of these meditations, and the idea is that each meditation was performed on a different day. So he would do meditation 1, he would think it up, write it up, think about it some more, go to bed, wake up, and start working on and thinking about meditation 2. So the idea is that, he was focusing his whole mind on thinking about these things very carefully. Now, whether or not you want to follow this pattern is up to you when you're reading and following along. If you do not spend the whole day actually thinking about the contents of these meditations, then perhaps it's better that you just read them all at once. That way you're going to at least use your time wisely. So if you're not actually going to go through the process of spending your whole day thinking about just the contents of meditation 1 and then moving on to meditation 2, then just read it all at once. You don't have to worry about whether or not it was set up to read or to be thought about day by day, at least for the purposes of this class. So in essence, the main idea of the meditations is to lead the reader step by step through the thought process involved in doubting everything that can be doubted. Afterwards, when we've doubted everything that can be doubted, and there's only certain beliefs left, Descartes builds up knowledge back so that the things that he once doubted, he now has arguments for why he should believe them. And basically what Descartes is trying to establish here is kind of like a rock-solid foundation of knowledge. So he's going to get rid of everything that could be wrong, potentially, and therefore poison his project of making a good body of knowledge, and start with only the things that he's really certain of. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but one metaphor that was given to me that is relatively helpful is, let's say you have a basket of apples and some of the apples are bad. Well, you could just pick the apples that look bad off the top, but the right way to do it is to dump all the apples out of the basket and only put the good apples back in. So that's a metaphor for what he's doing here with his beliefs. But again, I'll say more about that later. Thus, Descartes, both in his work and in his other work called The Discourse on Method, laid important pieces of groundwork for what we now know as modern science. This sort of thinking, this sort of careful step-by-step conclusion is the starting point of what the scientific project that we know today kind of got its ideas from. You only work from what you know and what you know for sure, and taking small steps, you can build up over a large amount of time a big body of knowledge. Besides this, Descartes is also prominently known to have established a school of thought known as, and this is important, Cartesian dualism, otherwise known as substance dualism. So, this theory held that the world is basically made up of 2 different sorts of stuff, different substances. You have the mental and the physical. The mental realm, the mind, is something over and above the physical form. The mind isn't something that has extension in space, whereas the body and the physical does have extension in space. And the mind is actually an entirely different stuff from the physical body and the physical world. This theory is most popularly associated with a misquote from Meditations II. Now, what is that misquote? Well, the very popular misquote is, "I think, therefore I am." Now, this is just, I say it's a misquote, but it's just kind of a handy rephrasing of what he was saying. The closest part to it in his actual writing is something along the lines of, "I am, I exist." So long as Descartes thinks, "I am, I exist," then he knows he can exist. But that's spoilers for Meditation 2, and we'll get to that pretty soon. So, for now, I just kind of encourage you to think what this quote is, and because maybe you've heard it before, and try to imagine why he's saying it and what it's going to serve for his purposes. You can pause the video now to do that, or you can just follow along and, not do that. It's fine with the two. So, lastly, another important innovation that Descartes is known for, that you might know as well, is something known as the Cartesian, make that darker, coordinates system. So what's the Cartesian coordinate system? Well, those of you that are up on your math will recognize this sort of thing, where you have a y-axis and an x-axis. And you have 0 down here, typically. You have 1, 2, 1, 2. And Descartes pioneered this sort of graphing system where you compare an x and a y on two different axes. And it's still used, as you know, to this day in mathematics to help visualize sort of what's going on in math. So in all, Descartes is known as what's called a rationalist. Now, what does rationalism mean, or to be a rationalist? So it means that basically his position is that the proper way to gain knowledge is through the mind, or through your reason. In order to gain knowledge, you don't necessarily have to go out there in the world. You can, like Descartes is doing in his meditations, sit back in your chair and just think about things. And by doing that, you're able to get knowledge by comparing different ideas to each other. Now, more derogatorily in the modern day, this is sometimes referred to as armchair philosophy. And this is usually a term used by people who subscribe to a different sort of school of thought known as empiricism, or to be an empiricist. Now, the empiricists, instead of thinking that you can just lay back in your chair and think about things and get knowledge, they think that in order to get knowledge, you actually have to go out in the world and see things and make observations and get data. Now, it may seem a little bit complicated that I just said Descartes was the founder in some ways of a large part of science, and yet he's opposed by these people who are all about observations, but that's a little bit more of a complicated discussion that we're going to have a little bit of in this course, but in order to get more of a sample of that, you need to take some higher level courses. So, with that out of the way, let's now turn to our readings for today, the meditations. So before I begin, I should note that some authors, such as Descartes, lend themselves to being very easily understood because of how clear their writing is. So as I mentioned, Descartes is trying to take us basically by the hand and lead us through his own thought process step by step. Now, some of his paragraphs are a little bit complicated for the way we use language today, and this is translated from French because Descartes was French. But ultimately, most of his paragraphs are pretty digestible. They usually only say one or two main things that, if you're following along, you can actually take notes on paragraph by paragraph. That's actually one of the things that I really like about Descartes, is that because he's so clear, I can actually be taking notes while reading his work is relatively easy. So this is a tip. When you're reading Descartes, the first thing you should do is number each paragraph. So each new indent should have a new number. Now once you've done that, as you're reading through, every time you finish a paragraph, write that number on your page and just write a sentence or two or three, depending on how big the paragraph is, which basically just summarizes what he's saying in that big paragraph. Now, I do this in my notes, the lecture notes, which you can find in the files section on Canvas, but I do encourage you to also do this for yourself, because if you're able to put in your own words, then you're really going to be able to understand what he's trying to do, the steps he's trying to lead us through. So, to begin, let's start with meditation 1. So, in this meditation, Descartes takes us through the process of doubting everything that we could possibly doubt. So that we're left basically with nothing that is on shaky grounds, that could potentially surprise us by actually being a false belief. So, the first thing he does, and I'm not going to be able to write every single paragraph down, but in principle, as I'm going through this lecture, I am going to be going through the paragraphs, through his work, as he goes through it. And so I'm first going to be addressing paragraph 1, then paragraph 2, and paragraph 3. When it's important, or I want you to be able to refer back to it, I will mention which paragraph it is, but I'm not going to be writing each of those here on the board because there's just not enough time for that. So, to begin with paragraph 1, the first thing that Descartes wants to do in the first meditations is establish this sort of backstory. And the backstory is that he has been wrong before. So, in the past, he has believed certain things, and those things turned out to actually be false. Now, besides feeling like a fool, perhaps, to some people or something like that, because he thought he believed something that was wrong, he also is kind of bothered just by the fact that he can be tricked into being wrong without him even really realizing it until it's revealed. And so he really wants to avoid that. He's been wrong before, and he doesn't want that to happen anymore. So this is kind of like setting up the whole project in his meditations. What is the meditations for? Well, the meditations is to solve the problem of him being wrong without him expecting it, basically. So he says that he waited to be older before he did this huge evaluation of his beliefs, but now he's perhaps old enough, and in any case, he can't put it off any longer. He's found a little bit of time, maybe he's on summer break or something like that, and so because of that, he's now going to take the time to really evaluate his beliefs. Now, in paragraph 2, he says that I don't need to prove that my beliefs are wrong, I just need to show that there is some doubt about them. So if I can doubt my beliefs, then, because I want to be very, very careful, I'm just going to take those beliefs and put them aside. It's kind of like the apple that you're not quite sure whether it's bad or not, so you're going to let it sit out for another day, and you'll probably find out. So, specifically though, he doesn't want to go through all of his beliefs, because all of us have quite a lot of beliefs. So let's say that these circles here are our beliefs, and we have quite a lot of them. And so, if Descartes was just going to go through each one of his beliefs and see whether he can doubt it, well, he's going to be there all day, because he's like, okay, I can doubt it. And so, the quicker way to do that, says Descartes, is to focus on the foundations of his belief. Now, what are the foundations of his belief? Well, according to Descartes, those are two things. We have the senses, and we have something akin to reason or logic, something like that. And these are kind of underlying all of our beliefs. So all of our beliefs, to some degree or other, depend on our senses being reliable and our ability to use logic being reliable. So Descartes basically says, he starts off in paragraph 3, that my senses have deceived me before. And it is just prudent that when something has deceived you before, or rather someone has deceived you before, you shouldn't put all of your faith in them a second time. So for that reason, for the purposes of the meditation, that gives him a reason to doubt his senses. So he can cross out his senses. And therefore, everything that he believes based on his senses also is unreliable. This includes very simple things like he has a body, or there is a sky, or he lives in France. There's all these facts about himself that he only really knows through his senses, either because people have told him that, or because he has seen it for himself, or felt it, or heard it, so on and so forth. But Descartes wants to say, surely some things are true, like the fact that I'm here in front of the fire. Only a madman would doubt that, I am here now. But the problem, says Descartes, and now we're going on to paragraph 5, is that dreams often deceive me about things like I am here in front of the fire. Now, while Descartes is writing the meditations, he's presumably at his house, and while he's thinking about these things or writing them, there's a fire there close to him. I should also say, throughout this particular lecture and the next one, at various times I'm going to be speaking in the first person, as though I'm speaking for Descartes. That's just how my notes were organized, because that's how Descartes writes in his meditations. He writes in the first person. And so I just want to put that out there just in case it might cause some confusion down the road. Now, again, so the problem about saying, oh, well, at least I know that I'm here, is that I might be dreaming, and so I might be deceived that I'm actually here. I might be just dreaming that I'm here in front of the fire. Now, some might argue that you can tell that you're dreaming based on whether or not the dream is very vivid or not. But, says Descartes, dreams can be very vivid too. They're not always vivid, but sometimes they are vivid. And if they can be sometimes vivid, then this could be one of those sometimes where you have a very vivid dream. So, says Descartes, stupor, or in other words, the opposite of vividness, can tell you that you are dreaming. If you're in a stupor and everything's kind of confusing and weird, then you're probably dreaming. But if you're not confused and in a stupor and things are vivid, that can't tell you that you're not dreaming. So there's this important distinction he wants to draw. But even as I'm assuming I am dreaming, says Descartes, there's still some things that are real. Surely the images that I'm dreaming of, just the images themselves, the fact that I'm experiencing them, that's real. So he compares them to sort of paintings. So even if the images themselves are made up, like how a minotaur is, like imagine a painting of a minotaur, the basic parts of those images might surely are real in the fact that they're being brought together. And even if we want to throw out all this high-level conversation about what the images are describing, so it's an image of a minotaur or a cat or a car or whatever, if we break it down to its most basic things, then at the very least, we can say that within something like a painting, what is real is the colors themselves. So within a painting, we have, an image, and within that image we have all kinds of colors that maybe what the colors are depicting aren't in any way real, but the fact that we have colors means that there's something really real about the green, there's something really real about the blue, and so on. And so that's what Descartes is trying to say. Well, maybe there are these universals that are real. And this would include other universals, things like extension, like form, like quality, like place, like time. All these things, maybe, because they're universals, are the things that couldn't not be real. And not only those, but the universals we find in mathematics. Those surely are real. How could it not be possible for 2 plus 3 to equal 5, says Descartes? Or how could it be possible for a square not to have 4 sides? Surely these things are real, just like the colors of the painting. Well, says Descartes, and now we're in paragraph 9, if I consider this carefully, I realize that if there is a God would be capable of such a huge and grand deception. So Descartes says, I might even be deceived about universals like the actual colors in the images I see, and things such as extension, quantity, and even mathematics. If a God is truly all-powerful, then he could make it so that when I think that 2 plus 3 equals 5, I'm actually wrong, and it actually equals 6, or something like that. But, says Descartes, such a deception, such huge deception, would be contrary to what we know as an all-good God. But, and now we're in paragraph 10, God might not be all good. I'm assuming and don't actually have a solid argument for why God is good yet. And so I can doubt this, says Descartes. For now, let us allow that such a deception is possible. Let's say that it's possible that there is this really powerful being out there that at every step is trying to trick us. Now, Descartes says in paragraph 11, and this is kind of him being careful because people have been killed for, saying even, tamer things than that. He wants to say, I cannot discard my previous opinions, my faith, but for the point of this exercise, let's discard my beliefs about God's goodness provisionally. Now, provisionally just means for the moment, just for now. And, paragraph 12, instead, let us assume that there is some sort of evil demon, or some sort of great trickster god, who deceives me in all the ways it is possible for him to deceive me. So at every step where it's possible for him to trick me with some crazy magic, he's doing that. And that's like the worst case scenario for knowledge, because then almost everything you know is probably going to be wrong. Anything that you could be tricked about, you might potentially be tricked about. And that's what Descartes is worried about here in the Meditations. And so he ends the meditation with a great shadow of doubt over all of his beliefs, because he doesn't know whether or not he's being tricked in all of these things. And he says that he needs to sort of consider it this way, to doubt all of his beliefs, even if it is difficult, because it is very important for him to find a belief that isn't trickable by the trickster god or the evil demon. That's his goal. He wants to find something that is solid that he can build upon. And the first step to that is doubting everything that you can doubt. Thus, at the end of the first meditation, Descartes gives reason to doubt all the beliefs which arise from the senses and from reason and pure logic. Because, as we mentioned, reason and pure logic, the only reason we think that that is solid is that we have a good God. Now, a good God actually is the thing in Descartes' mind that gives reliability to the senses and to reason and logic. But if the God isn't a good God, which he doesn't know yet, or he hasn't given himself an argument for yet, then you don't have these underlying things. And so the foundations of all his beliefs are now undermined. With this, Descartes concludes his first meditation, and he goes to bed. The next day, he begins his second meditation. So, meditation 2. Well, at the beginning of this meditation, Descartes mentions how he is bothered by yesterday's confusions. Obviously, all of his beliefs are gone. Most of what he thought he knew, he actually doesn't know for certain. Descartes decides to continue this process until nothing is certain at all, or at least something is found, as I mentioned, that is for sure. Things like sight, memory, senses, body, figure, extension, and movement are all potential illusions because of the trickster God, or the potential of a trickster God, and so these beliefs must be discarded. Descartes established provisionally that he cannot even know about God, and for that reason, logic is out of the window too. But can Descartes know about himself? That's what he wants to ask in paragraph 3. Well, can a trickster God trick me about myself? Asks Descartes. Descartes thinks not. He cannot be deceived into believing that he exists, for example, because in order to be deceived that he exists, he must be, well, existing. You can't deceive something that doesn't exist. And so by definition, even if something tried to trick him into believing he doesn't exist, just by the fact that he is being, or thinking rather, he is confirming his own existence. And we'll go through this a little bit more because he does bring this back up. Thus, the real form of the quote, I think therefore I am, is I am, I exist, cannot be doubted so long as that I think that I am something. But, paragraph 4, says Descartes, he does not yet know exactly who or what he is. Before, he thought he was a human, an animal, a body, rational, but all these are problematic ideas based on the senses. If he is not those things, then what is he? Well, he cannot be a body, so it must be some sort of a soul, says Descartes. Well, what is a soul? Essential to being a soul is cogitating. Cogitating. Otherwise known, in more common modern language, as thinking. So a soul is a thinking thing. If a soul stops thinking, then the soul stops existing. Descartes concluded that he is thus essentially a thinking thing. So, to recap then, he started off with knowing that at least he exists, and now he knows that not only that he exists, but he exists as what he understands as a thinking thing. But what else is Descartes? Well, Descartes says he cannot tell for certain just yet, and appealing to his imagination of what he might be just leads him back to his unreliable beliefs built by his senses, because whatever he imagines is probably just going to be pieces and bits of his memory from his senses put together to create an imagination. Thus, he concludes, all he can say is that he is a cogitating thing, a thinking thing, a doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, imagining, and sensing thing. So it is impossible to separate these things from himself, all these different actions of thinking. Insofar as these actions are occurring, he exists. But he seems to know that it seemed rather, that he knows the physical more than he knows himself, and more than he knows his soul. So for this, and this is where we get to paragraph 11, he gives the example of the wax. So all of the physical qualities of wax, form, sweetness, odor, color, magnitude, hardness, and coldness, all of the things you could say about the wax, these properties are changed and lost when the wax is brought near a fire. So is it still the same piece of wax? Well, it is the same piece of wax, obviously, but what is the same about it? Well, says Descartes, the wax can't be its physical properties, because the physical properties seem to be changing, and therefore, if they're changing, they can't be the same thing. All that seems to remain constant is the fact that it's extended, flexible, and changeable. But even then, extension changes, because as you bring it to the fire, it grows bigger and smaller. Thus, the wax is fundamentally an object of the mind, according to Descartes, an awareness, or a perception, or an inspection, or perhaps a judgment of the mind. It's a judgment that the wax remains the same from one step to the other. Thus, Descartes' beliefs about what exists come through his faculty of judgment, not his senses. The difference, though, between his judgment that the wax exists and the judgment that he exists is that he could be wrong about the wax existing. The wax could be a trick. So Descartes thus says that he cognizes himself more certainly and distinctly than wax or any physical thing. He could not be wrong about the wax, but even in attempting to think about the wax, he is confirming his own existence by virtue of the fact that he's thinking at all. So whenever he tries to think about anything physical, the first thing that happens is that he confirms himself. Thus, he concludes, and this is paragraph 60, he cannot know anything more clearly and distinctly than the fact that he himself exists. So in this second meditation, Descartes has gone from not finding any certain beliefs to having at least one. And that belief is that he himself exists, or more specifically, that he, as a thinking thing, exists. This seems like a small and an insignificant step, perhaps, but it sets him up to build back the rest of all of knowledge, almost. Descartes is focusing on the mind here, and this focus will later allow him to argue for the reality of not only God, but of the physical world. This thus brings us to our final meditation, which we're going to be covering in this lecture. Meditation 3. So the first thing that Descartes does in Meditation 3 is recap, because again, this is the third day. So he knows that he exists and that he is a thinking thing, a sensing, imagining, doubting, willing thing. Beyond that, he doesn't know much more for certain. Descartes does, however, establish a rule about knowledge, and this is the rule. He knows that what I clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Clearly and distinctly. Now this is a very key term because this is the tool he's going to be using throughout the rest of these meditations. Now, in some ways, you could argue that this is equivalent to the test of anything I can't doubt. So this test that he used in the first and second meditations is basically, in some ways, equivalent to the clearly and distinctly, but he doesn't quite spell it out yet. In any case, this essentially so he continues on from there, after establishing in paragraph 2 this rule of knowledge. Anything I clearly and distinctly perceive as true, he continues on and starts using this rule. Well, he says, as far as my senses go, the only clear and distinct thing I can know about them is that I am experiencing images. That they actually are appearing before my mind, in my mind's eye, so to speak. What isn't clear and distinct is the fact of whether these things I'm experiencing actually exist out there in a world outside of me. It's not obvious that they're not just illusions, but it is obvious that I am seeing something. Now, paragraph 4, arithmetic knowledge, so mathematical knowledge, seems to be clear and distinct. But, says Descartes, I discarded this, remember, in Meditation 1, on the grounds that I don't know whether or not there is a trickster God, or a good God. So, says Descartes, I must first address whether God exists and what God is like. So in paragraph 5, he starts. Before he can address whether or not God exists, he must get clear on the structure of thought. So, the things or the thoughts that consist of images of things, we call these things ideas. And let me actually make some room here. Let me get all these fake beliefs clogging up the system. So, ideas, otherwise known as images, key term, is a very specific term in Descartes' philosophy. For him, what this means is basically the actual images we see in our mind when we see something that is quasi-visual. Now, besides that, thought also consists of certain additions to this. And these additions come in various forms. And these are basically like special attitudes towards specific references or ideas. These include things like willing X, or affirming X, or being afraid of X. So it's basically an idea or an image plus a disposition. These dispositions can also take the forms of emotions, hating X or loving X, or volitions, wanting X to happen, or judgments, thinking that X is false, or thinking that X is true, or good, or moral. Now, in paragraph 6, he says, an image by itself can't be true or false. And a desire or an emotion by itself can't be true or false. There's no true or false about it. It's either you're having the image, you're seeing the image, or you're having the emotion, or you're not. There's no in between. A judgment, however, can be wrong if one's image of the world doesn't match reality. So if you have this image, and let's say that, so you have this image of a triangle in your mind, let's say this is your brain or your mind or whatever, but there's no actual triangle in the real world causing you to have that, then you can be wrong because you're judging that that triangle exists. Now, in paragraph 7, he moves on to the sources of his ideas because he's trying to consider, okay, well, what can I know about the world? Well, I have these ideas about the world, about things that exist in the world. Well, where did these ideas come from? So in paragraph 7, he starts talking about that. Some of my ideas are innate, he says, which are basically like built in. Some ideas perhaps I've received by chance, just by serendipity. And other ideas perhaps I've come up with myself. I invented them. And I don't really know which one of those accounts for this, right? Where did I get the idea that things exist outside of myself? And where did I get any of these ideas, really? Well, in paragraph 8, he says, let's focus on thinking that my ideas match the outside world? Well, typically I had two arguments for this. The first argument was that nature taught me to think this way. The second argument is that things in the world don't follow my will and often surprise me. And so for these two reasons, I took my sensations to come from things outside of me. Specifically from the object that I thought was causing the sensations in me. So in paragraph 9 he says, well, let's start testing these arguments. Let's begin with the first one. Nature taught me to think this way, to think that there are things outside of myself. Well, says Descartes, this just means that I have an impulse to think this way. Not that it was revealed to me by what's called a natural light. And this is another key term. Natural light. Now, what does he mean by natural light? He doesn't mean like, you have your window open and the sun's coming in. By this, he kind of means the same thing as these first two. This test of obvious truth that he has going on. He's called it undoubtability. He then expanded on it and called it anything I can clearly and distinctly perceive. And now he's taking more of a religious, sort of poetic approach to naming it, and he's calling it things revealed by natural light. So again, to recap, his belief that, let's put a smaller brain here and a smaller fake triangle here. So his belief that things exist outside of himself, if it was put in him by nature, it's not that it was put in him by a natural light or clearly and distinctly. It was just that it was put in him in the same way all of his other impulses are put in him. But because it's an impulse, he doesn't need to follow it, because obviously we shouldn't follow all of our impulses. Some of them lead us astray. Now, what about the other arguments? So we can't use that I was led to believe this by nature. Well, what about that these sensations, these things I'm experiencing in the world, don't seem to follow my will perfectly? Because if they did, then I would never be surprised. But, says Descartes, neither do our impulses or our dreams. When we have impulses, they're not necessarily there because we want them to be, and yet they are a part of us. Similarly in dreams, things happen in dreams that we don't want to happen, like in a nightmare, and yet, presumably, those dreams are our mind doing things. Now, even if the ideas came from outside of Descartes, that which they come from doesn't necessarily have to be the object that you think it's coming from. So you see a dog, and you assume that the image of the dog is coming from a real dog out there. But just because it's coming from something out there doesn't mean it's actually coming from a dog. So for those of you who have seen The Matrix, it could be some sort of computer simulation or something like that. They're just giving you these images when actually nothing is there. And Descartes also gives us an example. The sun appears to be small when we look at it. If you hold your hand up, it's not much, smaller than your hand. It's about that big, right? But according to astronomy, the sun is actually big. And so, because of that, there's this kind of disconnect between what we see and what's actually out there. Therefore, he says in paragraph 12, nothing but blind impulse has led me to believe that things exist separately from myself, things which transmit images of themselves to me, which I then sense and recognize. And it seems to me, says Descartes, to the degree that my ideas are taken to be representations of the world, I find more objectivity in some ideas than others. So some ideas seem to have more reality to them, more stuff going on, than other ideas which are kind of vague and confused. Now, in paragraph 14, he establishes an important principle that he's going to use to argue moving forward. And that principle is that a cause must have at least as much reality as the effect. So, according to Descartes, this principle right here is something that is clear and distinct, so he can know it. So again, he's kind of slowly adding certain principles that he can know through clear and distinct perception. And he says this because something cannot come from nothing. And if we think back to our pre-Socratic philosophers, this is very similar to some of the thoughts had there, that in some cases, if there is a thing coming about, there must be something that preceded it that was already there. A stone, for example, says Descartes, cannot be created except by something which contains everything found in the stone. So literally imagine you wanted to make a stone. Well, you need a whole bunch of carbon and other things that go into stone. Heat, for example, he goes on, can't be produced by something that isn't hot. Furthermore, the ideas of heat and stone can't be placed in me except by something which has those ideas already within it. In other words, something that has at least as much reality as the stone and the heat. So in paragraph 15 he says, if all ideas come from greater and more perfect forms or ideas, then, since there can't be an infinite regress of even more and more perfect things, there must be some one big original idea that contains all of the other ideas, that contains all of the reality of all of the other ideas. And this is where he's building up to his argument about God. In paragraph 16 he says that, and this is another principle, if the objective reality of one of his ideas, so let's say the effect is the idea, there's an effect created in him having an idea. If that idea is something that is so big and so complicated that it couldn't have come from himself, then that proves that there must be something outside of himself, other than just, like the world isn't just Descartes. There's stuff outside of Descartes. And the way he wants to prove that, again, is by saying that if within his head there's an idea way too big to have been made by himself, then there must be some other thing out there that puts that idea within his brain. Excuse me for my crude drawings. Now in paragraph 17, he says, I have ideas of God, of angels, of physical objects, of animals, and of other people. So these are basically the options of what could exist outside of me. Angels, people, and animals could be made up out of my ideas of physical objects, myself, and God. So those can't be the most basic things. My ideas of physical objects, on the other hand, would require only the ideas I already have of me. He says, for even my examinations of them aren't clear and distinct. For example, is the absence of cold, is cold the absence of heat, or is heat the absence of cold? Now, if my unclear ideas about physical objects are false, then clearly this is a result of my imperfection, he wants to say in paragraph 20. But even if they are true, then they are not so complex that I couldn't be the cause of them. So the physical objects are off the table for being a candidate to prove that things exist outside of himself. The idea of physical objects isn't so complicated that it must have come from somewhere else. Now, even the clear and distinct properties of physical objects don't help either. Because just as a stone is a substance, says Descartes, so too is he. Um, by knowing his own nature as a substance, he's able to take that idea and create the idea of a stone as a substance outside of himself. So, in paragraph 22, he says the only option left then for something that could prove that there are things outside of myself is God. Now, is there any idea within me that is so huge that it couldn't have come from anywhere except from God? Well, what is God? According to Descartes, God is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, and he created everything. And he's a pretty good guy. The idea of these attributes could not have come from me alone, says Descartes. And so, therefore, God necessarily exists. Now, this seems like a quick move on Descartes, and really it is. And he will build on it a little bit more, but let us consider what he's doing. He established that if he possessed an idea that he could not have created himself, then there must be something else that created that idea for him. His idea of God could not have come from him because it's so big and perfect. So therefore, it must have come from God. If that is the case, then God must exist in order to have created that idea. Now, having the idea of a substance makes sense, says Descartes, because I am a substance, and just like we did with the stone, I can just create things about my ideas of my own substance. But having the idea of an infinite substance doesn't make sense, because I am not an infinite substance, says Descartes. And since I am not an infinite substance, my idea of an infinite substance must have come from something else, from an infinite substance. He says, I could not have arrived at the idea of an infinite by negating the finite, because it doesn't work the same way you can do that with motion and rest. If you negate rest, then you get motion, because something that is not at rest is at motion. But if you negate something that is finite, you don't necessarily get the infinite. You could just get nothing. So he says that I clearly understand there is more reality in an infinite substance than in a finite one, and I am able to recognize my own imperfections only relative to this sort of concept of infinite perfection that I already possess. So my idea of God is clear and distinct, he says, paragraph 25. It has more objective reality than any other idea, and therefore is more indubitable than any other idea. But maybe these ideas are just potential within me, these ideas about perfection. And so they're just potential, not actual things. And this might be enough to actually give me the ideas of perfection. Just the mere potential is maybe what I needed. Unfortunately, says Descartes, this is impossible. The idea of God contains no potential. There's nothing potential about God. It's all or nothing. Otherwise, he'd be imperfect, says Descartes. Furthermore, I can always keep learning, whereas God, by definition, is already all-knowing. Lastly, an objective idea cannot be produced by the mere potential being. It must be produced by an actual being. So, paragraph 28, let us consider whether I could even exist if no such infinite being existed. Well, the options for what created me, says Descartes, other than God, are I could have come from myself, so I could have created myself, or I could have come from my parents, or I could have come from something that isn't myself or my parents and isn't God, so it would be something that's less perfect than God. Well, if it was from myself, well, then why didn't I give myself godly perfections? Surely this would have been easier than creating myself, says Descartes. Well, saying I always existed, perhaps, that also doesn't solve the problem, because although it solves the problem of not having to be created, it doesn't work because my existence also has to be maintained in the present. There has to be a certain preservation or act of preservation that's continually happening. And so basically saying that preservation requires a force just like creation does. And since paragraph 32, I recognize no power of preservation or creation within myself, then I must depend on something other than myself to have created me. Well, I could not on. Now, I could not have come from something less perfect for myself, because as we established, a cause must have at least as much reality as the effect. Nor could I come from something less perfect than God, because my idea of God would be more perfect than it. So again, that would violate the rule. So even if we allow that it was, let's say for the moment, allow that it was something less perfect than God, we can continue to ask about the origin of that, because if it's not perfect, then something must have brought it about. And thus, we would eventually arrive at a God anyway. Now, in paragraph 35, he says, I could not have gotten my ideas of God or my ideas about his perfections piece by piece from different places, because part of being God and part of his perfections is unity. And so whatever caused my idea of God in me must also itself have unity, says Descartes. Now, as for my parents, they do not preserve me continually in the presence as is needed, so that I don't just pop out of existence. And says Descartes, nor did they create me in any real sense. What they did was create a disposition in the matter which allowed my body to take form. Thus, having an idea of a perfect being proves that a perfect being, God, exists, because no other thing could have put that idea within me, says Descartes. But how did God put this idea within me? It wasn't through the senses, so, coming back to those earlier options, it must have been put innately within me, says Descartes, or in other words, within my very essence, within my nature. So, paragraph 38, he says, the knowledge of God is kind of like a maker's stamp, perhaps. I know that God exists and that I depend on him. I thus can also know that God is not a deceiver, because deceiving would be an imperfection. Thus, I find that contemplation of God's perfections is the greatest possible joy in life, says Descartes. Just not only realizing what God is, but also thinking about all the things that he is like. He is infinite, he is all good, he is all-knowing, he is one, he is immutable. All these things are things that, according to Descartes, not only allow him to know about himself, but allow him to know about God's existence, and, in our next lecture, quite a few other things. Now, at this point, he concludes Meditations 3 and ends the day contemplating the perfections of God. So, to recap his argument, therefore, we find that Descartes has established a few things. A cause must be as real or more real than the effect. And this implies that to prove that he's not the only thing that exists, he has to show evidence of some sort of effect within himself that is greater than himself. And he finds this effect within his idea of God. Since the idea of God could have only come from God himself, then God must exist. Any other less perfect option wouldn't be able to explain the existence of Descartes' ideas about perfection and infinity, and so therefore it must have been God. Let's look back then to consider some of the implications, which we will cover in more detail in the next lecture. Remember that God was the underlying foundation. So let's put this back up then. So we have our various beliefs, and we have the senses, and we have logic. And underlying those two things, we had God. Now, in the first meditation, we doubted whether there is a good God. And in the second meditation, even assuming there is a good God, we're able to figure out that at least we exist. Now, in the third meditation, using the fact that we exist and being able to explore the things that exist within ourselves, or at least according to Descartes, we're able to judge that God does in fact exist, which gives support back to our foundations, which gives supports to many of our other beliefs. But he wants to take it slowly, and that's what he's going to do in Meditations 4, 5, and 6, which we're going to cover in our next lecture. With that, this concludes this lecture. Join me next time where, as I mentioned, we're going to be covering Meditations 4, 5, and 6. In those meditations, Descartes completely rebuilds knowledge based on the premise that God exists. See you there.